Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar E-invoicing and Peppol Made Simple. My name's Will Smith. I'm an EDI analyst based in Ecosia's London office. Just a couple of housekeeping matters before we get into the webinar proper. Firstly, there'll be a question and answer session at the end, so please feel free to ask any questions during the webinar. To do this, simply click on the question mark speech bubble in the grey column on the side of your screen. If we aren't able to answer any of your questions during the webinar for any reason, we'll do our best to answer them afterwards via email. Secondly, in the document tab, in the same grey column, you should be able to see a white paper which looks at the specifics of Peppol and what you need to know to get started. There should also be two infographics available to download. The first of these is a calendar showing key e-invoicing deadlines in 2020, while the second shows Peppol's usage worldwide. Now I'll introduce you to Philip Legal, who will be your speaker today. Philip is a well-known contributor to UN CFAC standardization and has more than 15 years of EDI project experience in FMCG, retail, manufacturing, industry, and automotive. Philip has directly or indirectly overseen connections to over 3,500 companies worldwide. Some of those partners in the UK include GSK, Jaguar, Land Rover, and Iceland. Okay, over to you, Philip.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the introduction, Will. Now let's see what's on the menu for today. We'll give an overview of e-invoicing in general, then head on to e-invoicing in Europe, and then have a closer look at Peppol. And we'll then see how you can get started with e-invoicing and give an introduction of e-invoicing in an enterprise, then how to integrate it in an ERP system, and also examine how support for suppliers without EDI capabilities, e-invoice capabilities can look like. And then head on further to monitoring and support. In general, what is e-invoicing all about? Well, we have to start by examining what paper types or invoice types we actually have. And I guess the most important one are paper invoices. Usually they are sent via snail mail from a sender to a receiver, and typically no cost savings occur there. Further elevation of the paper invoice would be a fax invoice, where the electronic transmission occurs using the fax system, and the savings are only on the recipient side. And in regard to further electronic invoices, there are electronic and unstructured emails or invoices, which would be PDFs, Word documents, BNGs, and so on. Typically, you would receive these invoices using email, or you would download them using a web form, but no significant improvement occurs there. What we actually aim for, and whenever we talk about electronic e-invoicing in this webinar, we mean electronic and structured. And structured means that it is machine processable. And these machine processable formats are, for instance, XML, Edifact, and the like. They allow for a real system-to-system communication, and they provide savings both on the senders and the recipient's side. Typically, we would not employ email here, but we would communicate using special protocols which allow for acknowledgements of receipt, for instance, of a certain message. So why would we do e-invoicing at all? If we look at application scenarios of electronic invoices, typically we would be concerned with government-to-government e-invoicing, business-to-government e-invoicing, and B2B e-invoicing. We do not talk about B2C invoicing today. That would typically be, for instance, a PDF invoice you get when doing some purchase on Amazon. Why are governments so important here, and government regulations in particular in regard to e-invoicing? Well, 45 to 65% of all companies of a given country are typically suppliers to the public administration. So we see a strong significance in regard to new legislation coming in from governments imposing e-invoicing requirements on businesses. In regard to invoice types and saving potentials, there are significant differences if we are to examine the process from the invoice creation towards the invoice being correctly processed on the recipient's side. We can see that the paper invoice typically includes many manual steps, such as printing, preparing, packaging, and posting, and in particular on the recipient's side, and again, opening it, then unwrapping it from the envelope, reading it, entering it in the ERP system, checking the entries, and then eventually filing the records. A little relief is provided by doing PDF. However, the savings are only on the supplier's side, who is able to automatically generate the PDFs from his ERP system and send them to the recipient using email. Nevertheless, on the recipient's side, the disadvantages all remain the same. So a significant increase in regard to process automation is only achievable when doing real e-invoicing. Here we generate a machine processable format on the sender's side. It is transmitted to the recipient using automated protocols and can then be automatically absorbed from the ERP system on the recipient side, and typically also automatically booked if, for instance, purchase order references, dispatch advice references, and the like fit. One important aspect here is to consider the cost savings which can occur with e-invoicing. We do have a study here. It's a little bit old already, from 2011, conducted by Deutsche Bank, and it examined savings one can achieve when doing e-invoicing. And as one can see here, there are significant saving potentials on the sender and in particular on the recipient's side. However, one very important side note here is these savings can only be achieved when structured invoice formats are being employed. And what are structured invoice formats? Well, I guess the most important and famous one at this point is XML. XML is the abbreviation for, or the acronym for extensible markup language. We do have a separation there between markup, providing the structure of the file, and the actual content. If you are to look at the figure on the right-hand side, you'll see that the markup is provided in red and orange, and the actual content is provided in white and green. Obviously, this is just here in the representation, as an XML file is typically just a text file and does not know any colors. If there is a file structure to be provided, so how does an invoice actually look like? One is to employ XML schema, so providing the exact structure of an XML file, and additional integrity constraints can be provided using schematron. When we talk about an actual invoice file, it's oftentimes also called an XML instance. The other very important structured format is Edifact. Edifact is widely used in retail, automotive, and chemicals worldwide. Actually, there are multiple international Edifact-based standards. However, Edifact has little to no significance in the B2G domain. And also, interesting side note, while Edifact is quite famous and common here in Europe, it has little to no significance in the United States. There, the largest and the most common EDI format is ANSI ASC X12. If we move on to what is actually electronic invoicing, we are to examine here the PDF file. As one can see, there is a Zugfahrt file being depicted here. It consists of a human readable PDF and an included XML, which is machine processable. Zugfahrt is a German e-invoicing standard based on PDF and XML, and it combines the visual representation, so the PDF plus the relevant raw data, XML, all in a single PDF A3 file. And the XML structure, one can see here with the black background, is according to the cross-industry invoice. As this is not only a German initiative, there are developments towards a more pan-European format. It's then called Factur-X, which is an e-invoicing standard co-developed by France and Germany, and technically it is identical to Zugfahrt 2.0. So just an example of how e-invoicing can combine here in regard to hybrid format. If we are to look at e-invoicing in Europe in general, let's examine some industry-specific initiatives we see here before we go on to governmental initiatives. First here, VDA 4938, which is the de facto standard in the automotive industry. VDA is the Association of the German Automotive Industry, and VDA 4938 has been developed to fulfill the legal and fiscal requirements of invoices in the automotive industry. It is very industry specific, so it has little to no significance in other industries, such as retail, and the standard itself is based on UN EDIFACT D07A. The same or similar initiative exists in the retail industry. There it is called e-invoicing. That has been developed by GS1, so Global Standards One, a global standardization organization, most commonly known for standardizing all the barcodes, which you can find on an everyday product. e-invoicing itself is a subset of UN EDIFACT, as VDA is, and it defines the essential fields which are required by retail processes. It is based on UN EDIFACT D93A, D96A, and D01B. And actually, it is the de facto standard in the retail domain in Europe. Both of these standards, the VDA standard and the e-invoicing standard, they share the same fate. I would call it the fate of standardization initiatives. As one can see here, we do have a worldwide UN EDIFACT core standard, which is developed by the United Nations and is a generic and very broad standard. Typically, nobody would use that plain vanilla standard in everyday life, but industries would define their own subsets, such as e-invoicing, as we learned, or VDA, or that in the automotive industry. The problem here is that every company itself, again, defines a subset, such as Metro, Aldi, Sainsbury's, BMW, Daimler, and Jaguar Land Rover, and the like. So again, we do have a heterogeneity and a non-compatibility among these company-specific standards. That are the industry-specific initiatives. What about country-specific initiatives in Europe? A good example here is Fattura PA in Italy. Italy has a VAT tax evasion issue. So the amount of evaded tax in 2016 was almost 40 billion euros. One of the reasons that since the 1st of January 2019, we have a mandatory electronic invoicing system in Italy. All invoices from an Italian company to another Italian company must be exchanged through the central invoice exchange system, the so-called Sistema di Interscambio, as well as any invoice sent to a private person. So even if the private person receives a paper receipt, say at the till, that invoice must also be communicated to the SDI system. As of 31st of August 2019, we already had 1.3 billion exchanged invoices in Italy. The advantages are real-time visibility for the financial authorities and cost reductions through automated processing. Question there is, could such a system become mandatory for the rest of Europe as well? Well, the answer here is not at this point. Nevertheless, governments are already looking towards Italy and their transparency they have achieved there using the SDI system. So it's just a question of time until these central exchange real-time e-invoicing systems will become mandatory for the rest of Europe as well. A little bit of a look under the hood in Italy. So how does such a communication look like? An ERP system sends, for instance, an ERP export format to a service provider such as Ecosio, who converts the file and then forwards it to the SDI system. There are two types of acknowledgements being returned, the technical acknowledgement as well as a business level acknowledgement, and an archive information can also be fetched from the service provider then. As the system is mandatory in both directions, so I am required to send and I am also required to receive. The system also works in the other direction. In case I do receive something, the SDI system sends a Fattura PA XML file, which is then converted to an ERP import format for instance, SAP, that would be IDOC. And again, using an archive interface, the exchanged information can be fetched. That is an example for Italy. Other initiatives in Europe Here is a non-exhaustive list, is for instance Austria, where we have mandatory invoicing to the public administration since quite a few years. Hungary, which introduced mandatory tax reporting using the so-called online SAMLA system. So SAMLA is Hungarian for invoice. France has Chorus Pro, mandatory invoicing to the public administration, and Spain has two different systems, mandatory invoicing to the public administration, as well as mandatory tax reporting. And in general, as we will also learn, Peppol is gradually replacing these national e-invoice initiatives, which actually is good because we have one common exchange system. Interestingly, also the European Union has released a directive. So a EU directive typically has to be transferred to national legislation, and that EU directive 2014-55 EU mandates that all public authorities in the EU shall accept electronic invoices. As part of that EU directive, also a new EU-wide e-invoice standard will be developed. Actually, that standard has already been developed. We call it the European norm 16931. And all authorities in Europe must accept all formats which comply to that European norm. Currently, there are two XML dialects, namely cross-industry invoice and the universal business language. Nevertheless, nationally specific rules still remain valid. So Italy with Fattura PA, we just saw, Austria with the mandatory invoicing to the public administration, Chorus Pro in France, and so on. If we look at the current status of implementation of that EU directive, this chart here gives us an overview of how far the countries are. As we can see, there are some laggards actually in regard to the implementation. Nevertheless, most of the countries have already transposed the directive into national law and have set up the necessary systems. One example for such a, say, local or national system is then XRechnung. Rechnung would be German for invoice, and XRechnung is the core invoice usage specification of the European norm 16931 in Germany. It contains restrictions which are specific to the requirements of German invoices, for instance, discounts or the use of that Leitweg ID, which would be the routing ID for the identification of a recipient. So actually, the core invoice usage specification sort of makes the very generic European norm more specific to national requirements. The same SIOS also exists for Great Britain, for France, for Austria, for Italy, and so on. Valid syntaxes here are the cross-industry invoice, which is the same XML standard used for Subvert, and also Subvert 2.0 invoice is also valid XRechnung, and obviously also universal business language, which is the XML-based standard used as part of the Peppol e-delivery network. Here are two examples for XRechnung. First, the universal business language, as we can see, is a regular XML file following a certain structure, and so is the cross-industry invoice. So the two syntaxes we have here, which are valid for the European norm, are both XML-based. How do I get an XRechnung to a public administration? Well, there are two different types. Either I can manually enter the information using a web portal or upload an XML instance, or I can send it using email, the email, which would be certified email or Peppol. One example here for the delivery of XRechnung for web portals, there is one portal on the national level where all invoices to ministries and administration bodies on the national level can be sent. And given the structure of or the federal structure of Germany, there are also 16 different federal state implementations. So multiple different portals depending on the federal state. In particular, for those doing business in various federal states, this is a challenge to be met. So how can I overcome, for instance, the challenge that Germany is so scattered on the right-hand side, given the federal states? One can use Peppol, which is an e-delivery network. Peppol is the acronym for Pan-European Public Procurement Online and originated from an EU project. Peppol follows one of the cooperation models for EDI and e-invoicing. If we are to examine these cooperation models in more detail, a two-corner model would be an exchange of documents between a sender and receiver, no intermediary. So all exchange configuration is bilaterally agreed, such as formats, transfer protocols, error handling, and so on. Each connection is sort of a project, so high maintenance efforts, and is usually done by the in-house IT, and obviously that does not scale well. As such, there is the three-corner model, so message routing is done via a central hub offered by a service provider. Both sender and receiver must have the same service provider and no possibility to change the central hub, so there's a sort of vendor lock-in. That's why Peppol is in favor of the four-corner model, where sender and receiver have their own service provider that performs message routing, conversion, signature application, and the like, and also supports the onboarding of new business partners. And these service providers, as shown on the left-hand side, communicate with each other, so a seamless communication is feasible. And the in-house IT is typically only concerned with local interfaces. That would be the ERP import-export interface towards the service provider. In general, the challenges we have when setting up e-invoicing systems are that each industry has specific standards and exchange protocols. Each partner has its own e-invoice standard or exchange protocol or mode of project execution, as well as there are different requirements in regard to testing. So sometimes test systems are available, sometimes not. Sometimes there is a parallel phase and so on. And in order to overcome that heterogeneities, Peppol has been introduced. So the concept is a four-corner model for cross-border e-procurement, where both the sender and the receiver are free to choose their own dedicated Peppol access point. And the principle is you connect once and you connect to all. So just like with the mobile phone number, where you can phone anybody on that planet, or vice versa, you can be called by anybody on that planet. The same applies to Peppol. Using your access point, you can send to anybody in the Peppol network, and you can receive from anybody in the Peppol network. As opposed to other approaches, there are no roaming fees between the access points, and also the sender access point performs a validation of the sent data. So the receiver access point only receives valid XML instances. As said, it is essential that you do have a sender or receiver access point. Ecosia, for instance, is a certified sender and receiver Peppol access point. How do I identify somebody in Peppol? I do need the Peppol participant ID. It's a unique ID of a recipient of business documents in the Peppol e-delivery network. The capabilities of a recipient are stored in the service metadata publisher, and there is an overview of allowed ID types available on GitHub. And examples include here, for instance, a valid identification would be a codice fiscale in Italy, or a Norwegian VAT number, or an Icelandic national registry, or a global location number, and so on. So various different types of identifications are allowed. If you are to look up a certain Peppol participant ID, there are three different tools out there. So an official directory by Peppol, then another directory by Norway, and also a publicly available directory by helga.com. So sending an invoice via Peppol requires certain data. Obviously, you need to know the Peppol participant identifier. In your ERP system, you would store it on the debtor master or the underlying purchase order, depending on the specifics. The pattern is always identifier type : identifier. So for instance, an example for UK VAT ID would be 9932 : and then the VAT ID. And then obviously you need the UBL document, which would be created from the ERP system, for instance, by exporting an IDOC and then converting it, or the document is already directly created in the ERP system. The advantages: Peppol provides interoperability on a global scale. So once connected, you are connected to all Peppol providers. It provides e-invoicing standardization for B2B as well as B2G, reduced costs and easier procurement processes. And Peppol is already in use in 28 countries in Europe, plus Australia, Canada, New Zealand. In particular, Australia, for instance, also mandates Peppol, and also Singapore, USA already joined, and the trend is towards a growing user base there. So going from the technical details towards getting started, how do I actually start with e-invoicing in a company? Actually, the starting point is you need to set up the internal processes. Obviously, e-invoicing is different to paper-based accounts payable or accounts receivable. So there are some adaptations necessary. Second, you need to set up the ERP or accounting system in order to be able to process electronic invoices. In particular, workflow add-ons will certainly be required, and archiving solutions. Third, a selection of a service provider is necessary who helps you to fulfill current and future requirements. There, a decision has to be made between an on-premise and the managed service, which can be procured from the cloud. And typically, focus should be on standard modules instead of custom development. And again, standardized project execution is necessary in order to quickly onboard customers and suppliers alike, and then allowing for a reduction of project execution time and faster ROIs. So if we are to look at the big picture, one would need one central connection from the ERP system to a central integration hub. Here, Ecosia is shown as an example, could be any other system. And the integration hub then typically abstracts from the complexity on the right side. And right-hand side. And the complexity lies in the fact that there are various different transmission protocols, that there are various different EDI formats, and then there are different partners to be where you have to send the information to or get information from. So at the very bottom, as we can see e-invoicing. So various countries have various requirements, such as Italy, Germany, and Austria, and the service provider helps to abstract from these, local requirements, and allows you to seamlessly send and receive e-invoicing using one single connection. So how do we achieve the integration of the ERP system into the integration hub? That is one key question. Actually, there are two different ways. Let's start with the API-driven approach. Here's an example for an SAP system where the ERP system itself communicates with the integration hub using an API, so an application programming interface, allowing to seamlessly exchange e-invoicing information with the central integration hub. In this case, high performance and modern JSON REST interface is used using HTTPS, and no use of the proprietary and non-disclosed or RFC interfaces is being used. And you do have a seamless connection between the EDI domain and the SAP domain. The main advantage here is that you can track all sent and received invoices directly from within the SAP system. Here is, for instance, a screenshot where one can see sent and received documents, here order responses, as well as invoices and the like. And using a single click on a message directly in the ERP system, you're taken to a monitoring overview, so no additional login necessary, and you clearly see the delivery status of that certain invoice message on the recipient side. So as soon as the recipient has acknowledged the receipt of a message, for instance, using Peppol, you can see that status, that green status, also in your ERP system. If no API connection is being employed, also other connection types are obviously feasible, such as SFTP, AS2, and so on. So why do we need e-invoice workflows in ERP systems? With paper-based documents, you typically have your in-house workflow in regard to audit and acknowledgement and approval and so on. Since there are no more paper documents in place anymore with electronic invoices, you have to set up the necessary workflows in your ERP systems or in your accounting systems. These workflows, for instance, include for outbound invoices, the invoice audit. So before invoices are being sent, they must be approved. You need to determine the correct delivery channel. So it's no longer snail mail and paper. Obviously, it could be email or Peppol or any other transmission protocol. Then invoice delivery and delivery verification has to take place. And you need a traceability of the invoice exchange using, for instance, acknowledgements of receipt from the invoice recipient. In regard to inbound invoices, you need to register inbound invoices and reconcile them, for instance. with existing purchase orders or dispatch advices and so on. And then a verification and approval takes place, an account assignment, and also, for instance, an automated application of discounts if there are some. So in regard to integrating e-invoicing in your ERP system, an outgoing flow typically looks as follows. The ERP system exports one single export format, could, for instance, be IDOC in case of SAP, or any other export format of choice, such as CSV or XML and the like. The integration hub translates into the right format of the recipient and then delivers through the preferred protocol of the customer, such as, for instance, AS2 or Peppol, or even PDF invoices using email. Also important is that using an archive API, you're always able to fetch all sent information back to your ERP system, back into your local archive, or your enterprise content management solution, where they are then archived in order to fulfill legal requirements. An example for an outbound invoice workflow here using API Solutions direct billing control in SAP ERP and S4HANA looks as follows. As one can see here, the configuration of the preferred delivery type and delivery channel is done using the debtor record in SAP. So here I can either choose email or Peppol. And then later, if the invoice is, or after the invoice has been sent, I can see the delivery and receipt status of the sent invoices directly in the SAP user interface. So you never sort of leave your common environment, your ERP system. Instead, you see all messaging related information directly in the SAP system in that case. The same principle, of course, applies to Microsoft systems, Oracle systems, and others alike. In regard to incoming invoices, the same principle applies as for outbound ones. In this case, we receive supplier invoices, either structured or via a web interface, if that is being set up. Invoices are being converted to the import format of the ERP system. In case of SAP, could again be IDOC, and are then being forwarded to the ERP system. And in the ERP system, then certain workflows take place, such as invoice reconciliation, invoice approval, and the like. And again, archive retrieval is obviously feasible. So the original version of the invoice, the intermediate structure, and the final structure, which is being sent to your ERP system, can be fetched using that archive API. What to do with suppliers who do not support structured e-invoicing? Well, there's also a choice there. It's using a web interface. In that case, invoice data entry takes place using, or is done using a web form. Typically, you would also provide your supplier with a structured purchase order, because using that purchase order, the supplier can semi-automatically generate the necessary invoice information. So all position level items, header level items, and so on are taken over into the invoice document. And the less the supplier has to enter, the less errors occur. That is obviously only suitable for low e-invoice volumes, and not for high e-invoice volumes. In regard to monitoring and support, this is oftentimes heavily underestimated. With your, say, snail mail, you typically give the paper documents to the postal service, and you fully trust them to deliver the documents. In 99.9% of all cases, that also happens. Sometimes an envelope gets lost, but most of the time it works. In this case, there is no snail mail, but just an automated system, and that automated system must be constantly monitored. And what's required for success there? You need a 24/7 monitoring of the solution in order to guarantee correct invoice exchange. So in case errors occur, and errors often can occur in such electronic systems due to the unavailability of network nodes, network failures, wrong IDs, wrong export data, master data issues, and so on. You need a proactive reaction and failure resolution in order to get back to normal as soon as possible. Also, changes may occur in regard to the ERP export or import format. Also, these changes then have to be quickly integrated into the existing solution, and also the other side can change. Meaning, for instance, there might be changes in the format the Republic of Italy, for instance, accepts, or the Republic of Hungary accepts. In fact, that did occur in the past, and here you need a constant adaptation in case of such changes, for instance, in the format or the exchange protocol. A switch, for instance, in the exchange protocol already occurred in the Peppol network. Peppol previously employed AS2 as the underlying exchange protocol, which is now being replaced by AS4. So to sum up the e-invoicing findings, there is a clear trend towards e-invoicing, both in the B2B as well as in the B2G domain. The question is not if, but rather when that will occur. Due to technical requirements, which can be difficult, and also legal implications, e-invoicing can be a tedious and complex challenge. Nevertheless, with an external partner, that is certainly feasible. If one is to choose an external partner in order to realize e-invoicing, it is important that the partner can fulfill future requirements at little or no cost. And in case of doubt, always choose a standard solution in favor of a custom implementation, as custom implementations are typically not future-proof. And this is a personal side note here. Do not see the technical obstacles as disadvantages, but rather look forward to the savings which can be achieved. So we oftentimes see that in e-invoicing implementation projects. People are sort of disappointed with the technical effort which is necessary there. However, it is certainly feasible, and as soon as the system is being set up and running, there are huge savings, and companies wouldn't want to give it away anymore. Okay, just a quick check on the clock. We are super on time, and that also gives us some time for questions.
Thanks for that, Philip. We do have a couple of questions here. First, let's go for this one. We are running a rather old ERP system based on AS400. Is an integration with an e-invoice system feasible?
And AS4, yeah, we do see these guys around quite often, to be honest. Yes, that is certainly feasible. Typically, AS400 systems would work with a flat text file structure, such as CSV or other fixed length file formats. And these file formats can, for instance, be exchanged with an external converter or external service provider using SFTP. And by doing so, you can achieve e-invoice integration. So yes, it is certainly feasible, although there are some drawbacks, because, for instance, a communication of delivery receipts and the like, which you have with more modern ERP systems such as Oracle and SAP, is not feasible there. But in general, AS400 and e-invoicing, yes, they play well together.
Great, thanks, Philip. Now moving from AS400 to SAP, we got another question here. We're running an SAP PA solution in our company. Do you support a connection to SAP PA as well?
Yes, that is also feasible. PI is quite famous middleware for SAP, as there is also the business connector or the process orchestration module. With the PI, a connection would, for instance, be feasible using SFTP or also using AS2, as these two modules are being provided there out of the box. And by doing so, one can connect to these systems. Obviously, also an API connection would be feasible. The advantage of the API connection would be that you can always fetch the status of a sent message and then see whether the final recipient has actually received and acknowledged the message. So to answer the question, yes, that is also feasible.
Perfect. We probably have time for one more question. In regard to e-invoicing in Italy, how do I apply for the necessary certificates?
Yeah, that is a good one. In Italy, in order to send and receive documents to the central Sistema di Interscambio, so that exchange system, you have to become a certified client. And as a company, you have two options there. Either you go through the certification for being such a certified client yourself. So you will need your in-house IT, and that in-house IT will have to do all the certifications, certificate exchanges, and so on. In that case, yes, you have to apply for all the certificates yourself. Or option number two is you go with an external service provider, and that external service provider sends on behalf of you. In that case, no certificates are necessary. All that work has already been done once by the service provider for you, and you can leverage the existing connection.
Perfect. Thanks, Philip. That's about all we've got time for today. However, we will answer any questions that we didn't get round to via email. If you do have any other questions or want more specific advice about e-invoicing or Peppol, please do get in contact and we'll be happy to help. Contact details are on the screen now. Do also keep an eye out for our other upcoming webinars on our website or by following us on LinkedIn. Thanks again.